The USS Lexington sits perfectly upright on the floor of the Coral Sea, a 40,000-ton tomb of steel that looks more like a ship at anchor than a victim of war. In May of 1942, the crew believed they had beaten the fires and the floods, steering their massive home towards safety at 25 knots. They did not realize that an invisible, flavorless enemy was already filling the lower corridors, waiting for a single spark to turn their salvation into a hollowed-out furnace. Nearly 2 miles below the surface of the Coral Sea, there is a world defined by absolute darkness and a crushing pressure that exceeds 4,000 pounds per square inch. At this depth, the silence is so heavy it feels physical. For 76 years, this was the private domain of the USS Lexington, the ship affectionately known to her crew as Lady Lex. When she was finally discovered in 2018, the images transmitted back to the surface stunned the world. Unlike most wrecks of her size, which often strike the bottom with such violence that they become a mangled debris field of unidentifiable iron, the Lexington remains remarkably composed. She sits on the abyssal plain with a quiet, haunting dignity, her hull largely intact as if she is simply waiting for a crew that will never return. This brings us to the central paradox of the Lexington's final hours. To look at her now is to see a ship that did not suffer a catastrophic structural collapse during her descent. She did not break apart under the weight of enemy fire in the way many of her contemporaries did. In fact, on the afternoon of her death, the Lexington was winning her battle against the sea. Her fires were reported as under control, her significant list had been corrected by the tireless work of her engineers, and she was cutting through the swells at a speed that suggested she would easily make it back to port for repairs. Yet, despite these triumphs of damage control, the order was given to abandon ship. 216 men lost their lives that day, and the question that has haunted naval historians for decades is whether that loss was an unavoidable tragedy of war or the result of a fatal flaw hidden deep within the ship's own design. To understand why the Lexington died, we must look at her birth. Her story begins not as a carrier, but as a weapon of a different era. She was laid down in January of 1921 at the Four River Shipbuilding Company in Quincy, Massachusetts. Originally intended to be a massive Amagi-class battlecruiser designated as CCN-1. She was designed to be a predator of the high seas, built for speed and carrying the heaviest guns then available to the American fleet. However, the world was changing. In the aftermath of the First World War, the leading naval powers sought to prevent a ruinous and expensive arms race. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 effectively halted her construction when she was only 24% complete. Under the rules of the treaty, the United States was forced to reconsider its naval priorities. Rather than scrapping the massive hull and losing years of labor, the Navy made a visionary decision to redesign her as an aircraft carrier. Redesignated as CV-2, the Lexington became one of America's first true fleet carriers. This conversion meant that the ship was a hybrid of two different philosophies. Her hull was that of a battle-hardened cruiser, thick with armor and designed for high-speed engagement, but her upper works were a sprawling experimental airfield. She was launched in 1925 and commissioned in late 1927, standing nearly 888 feet long and displacing over 43,000 tons. She was a giant, a floating city of steel that represented the cutting edge of American industrial might. The engineering that powered this giant was as revolutionary as it was dangerous. The Lexington utilized a turbo-electric propulsion system, a complex arrangement where 16 massive boilers fed steam into turbines, which in turn spun enormous generators. These generators produced the electricity needed to drive 4 main motors connected to the propellers. This system gave the ship incredible flexibility and a top speed of over 34 knots, roughly 39 miles per hour. It allowed the commander to shift power instantly where it was needed most. However, it also meant that the Lexington was effectively a massive floating electrical grid. Miles of high-voltage wiring and hundreds of motor generators were threaded through every compartment, often running alongside the very systems that would eventually prove to be her undoing. As historians such as Sheila Fitzpatrick have observed in the study of complex industrial systems, the more sophisticated a machine becomes, the more ways it finds to fail in a chain reaction. For the Lexington, that vulnerability was her aviation fuel system. To support her air group of nearly 80 planes, the ship carried thousands of gallons of highly volatile aviation gasoline, or AV gas. This fuel was moved through a series of long trunk lines that spanned the length of the ship, passing through various machinery spaces and generator rooms. In 1927, there were no advanced vapor detection systems to warn the crew if these lines were leaking. The ship relied on the eyes and noses of sailors, but gasoline vapors have a treacherous property. They are heavier than air. They do not drift away. They sink into the lowest, darkest corners of the ship, pooling in the bilges and settling around electrical equipment, waiting for the right concentration to become a bomb. The incredible power of the Lexington's electrical system was demonstrated to the public in a way that remains a point of pride in American naval history. In December of 1929, the city of Tacoma, Washington, was facing a catastrophic energy crisis. A severe drought had dried up the reservoirs that powered the city's hydroelectric dams, leaving hospitals, homes, and factories in the dark during a freezing winter. The Navy stepped in with a bold plan. The Lexington was moored at a Tacoma pier, and her massive generators were bypassed into the city's power grid. For 30 days, the ship sat in the harbor, humming with the effort of providing 4.5 million kilowatt-hours of electricity to the people of Tacoma. It was a miracle of humanitarian aid, and it solidified the Lady Lex as a beloved figure in the American consciousness. However, for those who understood the mechanics of the ship, it was also a profound demonstration of the sheer amount of energy she contained. The same electrical infrastructure that could light an entire city was the same system that powered the fuel pumps and the ventilation fans. It was a grid that was never designed to be rattled by the concussive force of a torpedo or the searing heat of a bomb. The Tacoma mission proved that the Lexington was a source of life, but it also foreshadowed the day when that same electrical power would act as the primary ignition for her own destruction. As the ship moved into the 1930s, she was the crown jewel of the Pacific Fleet. Her crew was among the best trained in the world, and her pilots were pioneers of a new form of warfare. But beneath the polished decks and the bravado of the flight line, the ship remained a collection of contradictions. She was a battlecruiser disguised as a carrier, a ship of the old world carrying the weapons of the new. Her fuel lines were long and exposed, her ventilation was a maze of potential fire paths, and her heart was a high-voltage electrical storm held in check by the skill of her engineers. When war finally came to the Pacific in December of 1941, the Lexington was at sea, missing the tragedy at Pearl Harbor by mere chance. For the next several months, she was the primary shield for the American West Coast and a symbol of hope for a nation that had been caught off guard. She was a fast, powerful, and seemingly invincible presence on the horizon. But as she steamed toward the Coral Sea in the spring of 1942, the invisible enemy was already there, hidden in the very architecture of her hull. The crew did not know it, but the power inside her was a clock that had already begun to tick. The stage was set for a battle that would prove the Lexington could survive the best the enemy had to offer, only to fall victim to the very strength that had once lit the lights of a city. As the months of early 1942 unfold, the strategic chess match of the Pacific reaches a fever pitch, shifting from isolated raids to a direct confrontation for the future of the Southern Hemisphere. By mid-April, American intelligence services, working in the shadows of code-breaking rooms, discover a Japanese plan to seize Port Moresby on the southern coast of New Guinea. This move would provide a vital springboard for a potential invasion of Australia, a prospect that forces the United States to commit its limited carrier strength to a region known as the Coral Sea. Admiral Nimitz, understanding the stakes, assembles Task Force 17 around two of his most precious assets, the carriers Yorktown and Lexington. For the men aboard Lady Lex, this journey into the warm, tropical waters north of Australia is not just a mission, but a test of the very doctrine they had practiced for decades. On May 7th, the tension of the search finally breaks when American scout planes locate a portion of the Japanese invasion force. In a swift and coordinated strike, aircraft from the Lexington and Yorktown descend upon the light carrier Shoho. The attack is so overwhelming and precise that the Japanese ship is sent to the bottom in minutes, prompting the legendary radio call from Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, "Scratch one flat top." This success brings a surge of confidence to the Lexington's crew. They have tasted victory, and for a brief moment, it seems as though the power of American naval aviation is invincible. However, the Japanese main carrier force, centered on the veteran ships Shokaku and Zuikaku, remains undetected and very much in the fight. The true test begins on the morning of April 8th, under a sky that is bright and clear, with only a few scattered clouds to provide cover. At 9:11 a.m., the Lexington's primitive but vital radar screens pick up a massive formation of 69 incoming aircraft. The combat air patrol of Wildcat fighters scrambles to intercept, but they are outnumbered and struggling to find the enemy in the vast three-dimensional space of the sky. By 11:20 a.m., the Japanese strike reaches the American formation. The Lexington, despite her massive size, maneuvers with surprising grace, her wake carving white arcs in the blue water as her gunners fill the air with anti-aircraft fire. But the coordination of the Japanese torpedo bombers is relentless, attacking from multiple angles to ensure that no matter which way the ship turns, she remains a target. Two Type 91 torpedoes strike the Lexington on her port side near the forward aviation fuel tanks. The impact is staggering, sending a shudder through all 888 feet of the ship's length and venting a massive column of water into the air. Almost simultaneously, 3 bombs, each weighing roughly 533 pounds, penetrate the flight deck. One bomb strikes the 5-inch ready service locker, while others tear through crew spaces and into the hangar, starting fierce fires that send thick black smoke billowing across the flight line. To any observer, the Lexington appears to be a ship in her death throes, listing sharply to port and wreathed in the orange glow of uncontrolled flames. Yet, it is in this moment of crisis that the training and spirit of the American sailor shine the brightest. Damage control teams, wearing heavy asbestos suits and carrying bulky oxygen rebreathers, plunge into the smoke-filled corridors. They work with a mechanical efficiency that defies the chaos around them, flooding the ammunition magazines to prevent a catastrophic blast and using the ship's powerful pumps to counter the flooding. Within an hour, they have performed what can only be described as a miracle of engineering. The significant list has been corrected, the fires in the hangar are being suppressed, and the ship is back on an even keel, making 25 knots, or about 29 miles per hour. Captain Frederick Sherman, observing the progress from the bridge, assesses the damage as manageable. The Lexington is wounded, certainly, but she is still a fighting unit. Her engines are humming, her steering is responsive, and she even begins to recover her own aircraft that have been circling overhead. There is a palpable sense of relief throughout the ship. The Lady Lex has taken the enemy's best punch and stayed on her feet. Historians like Jonathan Spence have noted that this is a recurring theme in naval warfare, the moment when a crew believes they have passed the worst of the storm, only to find that the environment has changed in ways they cannot yet see. The ship is heading home, and for the thousands of men on board, the battle seems to be over. But deep beneath the waterline, in the silent and inaccessible spaces between the bulkheads, a new and far more dangerous battle is just beginning. The torpedo strikes on the port side had done more than just let in the sea. They had buckled the heavy steel frames and ruptured the long aviation gasoline trunk lines that ran like arteries through the ship. Gallons of unburned fuel are leaking into the voids, and more importantly, the fuel is vaporizing. These gasoline vapors are invisible and heavier than air, meaning they do not rise to be sucked out by the ventilation systems. Instead, they flow downward, following the natural contours of the hull and pooling in the machinery spaces and generator rooms. As the ship moves through the swells, the vibration of the turbines and the movement of the sea help to mix these vapors with oxygen, creating a highly explosive atmosphere in the very heart of the Lexington. The sailors in the upper decks are celebrating their survival, unaware that the lower decks are filling with a gaseous bomb. Records from the day indicate that there were some reports of a strange, sweet smell in a few of the lower compartments, but in the heat and noise of the post-battle cleanup, these warnings are not immediately understood. The Lexington is essentially breathing in her own poison, her complex internal architecture acting as a container for a disaster that no one is prepared to fight. The tragedy reaches its first tipping point at 12:47 p.m. In one of the main generator rooms, a small motor generator, part of the ship's extensive electrical grid, produces a routine, microscopic spark. In a normal environment, this would be of no consequence. But in a room where the gasoline vapor has reached its critical explosive concentration, that spark is the match that lights the fuse. A massive internal explosion rips through the center of the ship without warning. This is not the sharp, metallic crack of an enemy bomb, but a deep, muffled roar that originates from within the Lexington's very bones. The blast is devastating, centered in an area where an entire damage control party is gathered to coordinate repairs. They are killed instantly, their equipment shattered, and their communication lines severed. This first explosion is a catastrophic setback because it does more than just kill men. It ruptures additional fuel lines, feeding a fresh supply of liquid gasoline into an area that is now an active inferno. The fires that the crew thought they had extinguished an hour ago are suddenly dwarfed by a new fire that is being fed by the ship's own lifeblood. The structural integrity of the internal bulkheads is compromised, and the ventilation shafts, meant to provide life-saving air to the engineers, begin to act as chimneys, carrying the heat and the blast upward into the hangar deck. On the bridge, the shock of the explosion is felt as a violent upward heave. Captain Sherman and his officers are suddenly faced with a terrifying new reality. The enemy that hit them at 11:20 a.m. was gone, but the ship was now attacking itself. The miracle of damage control that had been achieved only an hour earlier begins to unravel with terrifying speed. The Lexington is no longer a ship recovering from battle. She has become a forensic puzzle, a complex machine experiencing a total systemic failure. In the silence that follows the initial roar, the only sound is the frantic clatter of boots on steel as the crew realizes that their home is being consumed by a power they cannot see and an enemy they cannot find. Meanwhile, behind the scenes of the desperate firefighting efforts, the heavy silence of the lower decks is replaced by a low, rhythmic thrumming that signals the ship's internal temperature is rising to catastrophic levels. While the initial explosion at 12:47 p.m. was a singular shock, it serves as the catalyst for a much more predatory sequence of events. The structural bulkheads, weakened by the heat and the earlier torpedo impacts, begin to groan under the stress of shifting weights and thermal expansion. In the hangar deck, where the air was once thick with the smell of gasoline and sweat, the environment is now dominated by a searing, dry heat that exceeds several hundred degrees Fahrenheit. This is no longer a battle against a fire, it is a battle against a chain reaction that is slowly consuming the very foundation of the ship. At 2:45 in the afternoon, a second massive explosion tears through the central section of the hangar deck. This blast is even more violent than the first, fueled by the accumulation of vapors that have continued to migrate upward through the damaged ventilation shafts. The force of the explosion is so great that it buckles the armored flight deck from below, creating a visible hump in the wooden planks where pilots once landed their planes. This second blast effectively severs the last remaining water mains used for firefighting, leaving the damage control teams standing in the dark with dry hoses. The men find themselves in a hellish landscape where the steel walls are hot enough to ignite paint on contact, and the primary weapons of the ship, the bombs and torpedoes, are beginning to absorb the ambient heat of the inferno. By 3:25 p.m., a third explosion rocks the Lexington, centered further aft where the ammunition storage for the air group is located. This blast signals the start of what naval engineers call a cook-off, a terrifying phenomenon where munitions detonate due to external heat rather than a triggered fuse. In the aft hangar spaces, 500-pound bombs and torpedo warheads weighing over 1,000 pounds each are being roasted in a furnace of the ship's own making. Every man on board understands the math of the situation. They are standing on top of hundreds of tons of high explosives that are reaching their thermal limit. The Lady Lex is no longer a refuge. She is a ticking clock that has entered its final minutes. As historians such as Roderick McFarquhar have observed when studying the collapse of large, complex organizations under pressure, there is a moment where the physical failure of a system becomes a psychological reality for those tasked with maintaining it. On the Lexington, that moment arrives as the communication lines fail entirely and the heat makes the engine rooms untenable. The engineers, who have stayed at their posts in temperatures reaching 140 degrees Fahrenheit, are finally forced to evacuate the lower spaces. They leave behind the humming turbines and the massive generators that once powered a city, knowing that they are leaving their ship to her fate. The realization spreads through the ranks that the ship is now an entity possessed, destroying herself from within through a series of inevitable mechanical steps. At 5:07 p.m., Captain Frederick Sherman stands on the bridge and makes the decision that no commander ever wishes to face. He issues the order to abandon ship. It is important to understand that in the culture of the United States Navy in 1942, this is not seen as an act of surrender or a failure of nerve. Instead, it is a final, calculated act of stewardship. Sherman recognizes that the ship is lost, but the lives of his 2,700 crew members are still within his protection. By giving the order when he does, he chooses the preservation of his men over the hollow pride of staying with a doomed vessel. The orders pass through the ship by word of mouth and by the blowing of whistles, a low and somber signal that marks the end of an era for the Pacific Fleet. The evacuation that follows is a testament to the discipline and character of the American sailor. There is no panic, no frantic rush for the rails. Instead, the men form orderly lines, helping the wounded and ensuring that the youngest and least experienced sailors go first. They use ropes, cargo nets, and fire hoses to climb down the massive steel sides of the ship into the warm waters of the Coral Sea. Below them, a fleet of destroyers and cruisers closes in, their crews watching in awe as the giant carrier continues to burn. Some sailors even take the time to eat ice cream from the ship's stores before they depart, a final, defiant act of normalcy in the face of catastrophe. Captain Sherman remains on the bridge, a solitary figure watching over the departure of his crew. He moves through the darkened, smoke-filled command center, ensuring that every living soul has been accounted for. He is the shepherd of this floating city, and he refuses to leave until he is certain that he is the last man remaining. By 5:30 p.m., as the sun begins to dip lower toward the horizon, Sherman finally descends toward the flight deck. Just as he prepares to leave, the final and most violent act of the Lexington's life occurs. Deep in the aft hangar, the torpedo warheads finally reach their detonation point. The resulting explosion is a spectacle of terrifying power. A massive fireball, hundreds of feet in diameter, erupts through the flight deck, followed by a column of black smoke that towers thousands of feet into the air. The blast is so powerful that it literally lifts the massive armored hangar deck off its supports, venting the internal pressure in a single gargantuan roar. Debris, including sections of aircraft and pieces of the ship's own structure, is flung hundreds of yards into the sea. Captain Sherman is forced to dive overboard into the water to escape the falling steel, where he is eventually pulled onto a waiting destroyer. He is the last man off, a leader who stayed with his ship until she literally tore herself apart. Even after this final explosion, the Lexington refuses to sink quickly. She wallows in the gentle swells of the Coral Sea, her hull glowing a dull, angry red in the gathering twilight. She is a blackened, hollowed-out husk, yet her battlecruiser bones are so strong that she remains buoyant, a ghost ship illuminated by the fires that still rage in her belly. To leave her in this state would be a danger to navigation and a potential prize for any Japanese forces that might return to the area. At 7:15 p.m., the commander of the task force issues the final order to the destroyer USS Phelps. The Phelps moves to within 1,500 yards of the carrier and fires a spread of 5 torpedoes. 2 of the torpedoes strike home, their explosions echoing across the quiet water. The Lexington, having survived a morning of aerial combat and an afternoon of internal hell, finally accepts her fate. At 7:56 p.m., she rolls slowly to her port side, the water rushing into the scorched hangars with a sound like a great indrawing of breath. She slips beneath the surface of the Coral Sea, taking with her the stories of 216 men who gave their lives in her service. 35 of those men died during the initial Japanese air attack, but the remaining 181 were victims of the internal explosions and the fires that followed. As the bubbles from her sinking rise to the surface and the oil slick begins to spread, the men on the surrounding ship stand in a long, silent salute. They have watched the death of a giant, a ship that had been a part of their lives and their national identity for 15 years. The Lady Lex is gone, her journey ending in a place where the sun cannot follow. But as she descends into the deep, she leaves behind a legacy of resilience and a crew that had learned the hardest lesson of naval warfare, that the most dangerous enemy is sometimes the one you carry within your own heart. The silence that follows her disappearance is not the silence of defeat, but the quiet of a struggle that has finally come to an end. As the decades unfold, the memory of the Lexington begins to transform from a living experience of veterans into a mythic mystery of the deep. For 76 years, the ship existed only in the yellowed pages of deck logs and the fading recollections of the men who survived her final day. She was a ghost of the deep, a legend whose physical presence had been swallowed by an ocean so vast that it seemed capable of hiding even a 1,000-foot-long giant forever. The search for the Lexington was not merely a hunt for steel and rivets. It was a quest to find the closing chapter of a story that had remained unfinished since the summer of 1942. The Coral Sea is a deceptive expanse, covering over 1 million square miles of the Pacific. While survivors of the sinking had recorded her last position with as much accuracy as a burning ship and a sextant would allow, the margin for error was immense. At the time of her loss, navigation was an art of approximation, and the currents of the ocean can move a drifting hull miles away from its last known coordinates before it finally begins its long descent. For most of the 20th century, the Lexington was effectively beyond reach, resting at a depth of nearly 9,942 feet. At nearly 2 miles down, the darkness is absolute and the environment is static, preserving the ship in a pressurized time capsule that early sonar technology simply could not penetrate. The breakthrough came through the vision and resources of the late Paul Allen, the Microsoft co-founder who dedicated the final years of his life to locating the great shipwrecks of the Second World War. His research vessel, the RV Petrel, was a masterpiece of modern maritime technology, specifically designed for deep-sea exploration. Unlike the search teams of the past, the Petrel utilized an autonomous underwater vehicle, or AUV, rated for depths of up to 19,685 feet. This robot could fly just a few hundred feet above the seafloor, using multi-beam sonar to map the terrain with a precision that turned the blurry shadows of the abyss into high-definition digital landscapes. On March 4, 2018, after weeks of systematic searching through the deep canyons off the coast of Queensland, Australia, the sonar screens on the Petrel finally painted an unmistakable image. Resting on the flat, silty expanse of the abyssal plain was a massive hull section standing perfectly upright. The discovery sent a wave of quiet reverence through the crew as the remotely operated vehicle, or ROV, was deployed for a visual survey. The cameras descended through the water column for hours, eventually revealing the ghostly white silhouette of the Lexington's hull. The ship had not crumpled. She had settled into the mud with a grace that mirrored her nickname, Lady Lex. The most haunting and emotionally resonant discovery, however, was not the ship herself, but the aircraft scattered around her. About 1,640 feet to the west of the main hull, the ROV lights illuminated a cluster of planes that looked as though they had been parked only yesterday. There were 7 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, 3 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and a single F-4F Wildcat fighter. In the cold, oxygen-poor water of the deep, the paint was still visible, and the 5-pointed star insignia of the United States Navy shone through the gloom. Most striking of all was the fact that many of these aircraft had their wings still folded in the carrier configuration, a silent testament to the moment the internal explosion stopped the clock on the hangar deck. Historian Anne Applebaum has reflected on the importance of physical monuments as anchors for collective memory, and these aircraft serve as exactly that. They are not just machines, they are frozen moments of human intention. To see the folded wings of a Devastator nearly 10,000 feet below the surface is to see the exact state of the ship at 12:47 p.m. on May 8, 1942. It is a forensic snapshot of a crew that was preparing for a next launch that would never come. These planes are among the rarest in the world, and their preservation in the deep provides a level of detail that no museum on land could ever hope to replicate. The forensic survey of the hull provided the final, bulletproof evidence required for official identification. The ROV cameras documented the distinctive hull number, CV-2, still visible on the rusted steel. They measured the overall length of the main section at 888 feet, a perfect match for the Lexington's battlecruiser-derived frame. The distinctive turbo-electric generator housings, which had once powered the city of Tacoma, were found within the debris field, their copper windings and heavy casings identifying the unique heart of the ship. Furthermore, the survey confirmed the presence of the 8-inch gun mounts, a feature that was removed from later carrier designs but remained a signature of the Lexington at the time of her sinking. Perhaps the most significant forensic finding was the pattern of damage on the port side. The ROV was able to clearly document the impact points of the 2 Japanese torpedoes, but it also captured the outward bulged steel of the internal compartments. This physical evidence perfectly matches the survivor testimony of the gasoline vapor explosions. It proves that while the enemy provided the initial trauma, the ship was indeed torn apart by the internal pressure of her own fuel system. The wreck stands as a silent witness to the enemy within, confirming that the Lexington's design, while revolutionary, carried the seeds of its own catastrophic failure. In the decades since 1942, historians have re-evaluated the Battle of the Coral Sea, and the discovery of the wreck has only deepened this analysis. While the loss of the Lexington was a tactical blow to the United States, it was a profound strategic victory. By stopping the Japanese advance toward Port Moresby, the Lexington and her crew bought the precious time needed for the American Navy to prepare for the decisive engagement at Midway just 1 month later. The sacrifice of Lady Lex was the price paid to halt the expansion of an empire, and the wreck remains a monument to that pivotal shift in the war's momentum. The site is now protected under the Sunken Military Craft Act, ensuring that the Lexington remains a hallowed war grave. No salvage is permitted and no artifacts may be removed, a policy that respects the 216 sailors who still remain at their posts within the hull. Sheila Fitzpatrick notes that the preservation of such sites serves as a forensic baseline for understanding how metal survives in the extreme conditions of the abyss, but for the families of the lost, the value is far more personal. It is a place of closure, a final resting spot that is honored and protected by the laws of nations and the silence of the sea. The legacy of the Lexington did not end in the Coral Sea. Within weeks of her loss, the workers at the Quincy shipyard where she was built petitioned the government to rename an Essex-class carrier then under construction. The new ship, CV-16, inherited the name Lexington and went on to serve with such distinction that the Japanese believed she was a ghost, repeatedly claiming to have sunk her only for her to reappear in battle after battle. This second Lexington, known as the Blue Ghost, served through the Cold War and now stands as a museum ship. But she carries within her the spirit and the traditions born on the decks of the original CV-2. Today, the first Lexington remains nearly 10,000 feet below the surface, a time capsule of courage and a masterclass in naval engineering. She is no longer a weapon of war, but a teacher of history. As the ROV lights fade and the Petrel moves on to its next mission, the Lady Lex is returned to the darkness she has known for over 80 years. She sits upright, her guns silent and her aircraft waiting, a permanent reminder that some victories are measured not in the ships that survive, but in the spirit of the men who sail them and the legacy they leave behind. The journey of the USS Lexington is a story that bridges the gap between the monumental and the deeply personal. To look at her resting upright on the seafloor is to see a ship that refused to be defined by her destruction. She was a vessel born from a treaty, built to be a predator, and remembered as a savior. From lighting the homes of Tacoma during a frozen winter, to standing as the first line of defense in the Coral Sea, the Lexington embodied the dual nature of power, the capacity to create, and the terrible potential to consume itself. Her loss was not a result of a lack of skill or bravery, but a consequence of the very complexity that made her great. In the silence of the deep, the Lady Lex offers us a rare opportunity to reflect on the nature of sacrifice. The 216 men who remain with her did not die in a moment of defeat, but in a moment of defiance. They fought a battle on two fronts, against an external enemy in the sky and an internal enemy in the corridors of their own ship, and they did so with a discipline that saved thousands of their brothers. Finding the wreck after 76 years does not just solve a mystery, it restores a connection to those men. It gives their families a place to look toward and gives the world a tangible monument to a generation that changed the course of history. As we conclude this exploration, we are reminded that history is never truly lost as long as we are willing to search for it. The Lexington remains a sentinel in the dark, a time capsule of the human spirit preserved by the pressure and the cold. She teaches us that even in the face of systemic failure and overwhelming odds, there is a dignity in the struggle. The Red Castle of the Japanese and the Lady Lex of the Americans now share the same eternal silence of the Pacific, their stories intertwined in the deep. We honor them best by remembering the lessons they left behind and the courage it took to sail them into the unknown. Thank you for spending part of your day with us. If this journey meant something to you, we'd be honored to have you with us again. Until next time, stay curious and take good care.